Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Wednesday, January 26th, 2022. And on this episode, I want to go back to some core foundational principles, looking at what the founding generation considered the greatest threat to liberty. And there were varying opinions on this over a period of a number of decades, but there's definitely a recurring theme. And I want to highlight five main categories, sharing the words of leading founders and old revolutionaries. I've got a bunch of great quotes from people like Washington, Madison, Jefferson, Adams, and others. And I'm going to highlight five main categories: war, centralization of power, what they called consolidation, factions, fear, and attacks on free speech. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow us, all the archives for closing in on 4 years. On individual episodes, I publish a blog post for every single episode, and there you're going to find all the links that I mention in the episode, all the references. Today, I've got a lot of original source documents, and that way you can read them in context from the founders on your own time rather than just hearing me blab about them. And that way you can also use them for your own research and cite them in the future as well. You can find, I generally publish that blog about an hour to 2 hours after the live show is done. And then I also have all the different platforms we're on. We live stream on the mainstream ones like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and Twitch. We also live stream at the very important decentralized and censorship-resistant Odyssey.com. It's my favorite video platform out there. We also upload our archives over to Gab and We and Minds and Brighteon and BitChute and Sovereign.media, which is Ben Swan's great new platform. We have the audio-only podcast edition all over the place, and even our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. We make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. And while we're allowing people another minute or so, maybe 2 minutes, to get notifications from those mainstream platforms, which aren't as reliable as we'd like them to be on this, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. I appreciate you all being here. There's Alan Mosley TV. Great to see you. You don't love liberty if you don't open a browser tab for every platform TAC streams through. That's awesome. Dixie Strong in Alabama, Haji in Oakland County, Michigan, Richard Banks in Kansas, Cheriton Farmer in Missouri, Clay Kent. There's Alan Mosley on another platform, Jennifer Coop, Dave Simmons, Run Level Run, Shane Bryce, Aaron Havernick, Cowboy Roy Rogers, Alan Hughes. Haven't seen you in a while. Good to see you. Joe got zucked on Facebook. That's a great screen name. Mike Takash, Patricia Dance, Punish 1871, Jennifer Coop says, I love how you blab about things. Yeah, I know, but if I keep going, this will never end. We'll have a 30-minute intro, and I'll be talking for 2 hours. And I got other work to do, and I love hanging out with you guys, but we got to roll. Senator DT in Elkhart, Indiana. Ed Hen has come for the fajitas. I'm always in for the food. Lynn Goodrich in Iowa. Hey, there's an important bill protecting the right to keep and bear arms from federal infringement. Senate File 2002. That probably needs your help in Iowa. It's in the Senate Judiciary Committee. And anyways, I will look back in the chat a little bit later today or later in the show and see if I can get back to some other questions or suggestions for future episodes. Now, with that, let's get right to it. And I want to start out with a quote from Thomas Paine, one that actually got me thinking about, like, oh, okay, I should do an episode about this. We posted it on our socials yesterday or the day before. It's from his dissertation on first principles of government, something that you don't hear covered very often. This is Thomas Paine's birthday week, and so we wanted to share a little bit from him as well. And here's how Paine put it. He that would make his own liberty secure must guard even his enemy from oppression. So I was looking at that, and I'm like, yeah, okay. Well, everywhere we turn, there's an attack on liberty. Everywhere we turn, all the time, all the regulations and rules and mandates and controls and laws and orders and all this stuff at a state, federal, local level, doesn't matter. It happens all over the place. So I was thinking, well, maybe we could kind of narrow this down to what the founders considered the biggest threats to liberty. And so I put together some categories. Like I mentioned, 5 different categories. And maybe these are things that when we're overwhelmed with the constant attacks on our rights, our ability to travel, our ability to just live life without interference from government, maybe we can have some focus on the things that might have the most impact. I don't know, just a thought, whether it's education or activism or resistance or nullification or one or all of those. So let's get to these. And I want to start out with Category number one, and these aren't in any particular order other than how I decided I wanted to put it. The first one is war. And for war, there's probably none better on this than James Madison, even though when he was in office, he was probably not the best at this, following his own advice. And here he is from a paper called Political Observations, 420, 1795. Of all the enemies to public liberty, so James Madison, so-called father of the Constitution, says the number one enemy to public liberty, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War, he continued, is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. And I know those of you who watch or listen to the show regularly, you're like, okay, Bolden, I've heard that 800,000 times. Well, it's going to be 800 zillion times because as long as there's always wars and threats of war, I have not done enough on this. You have not done enough on this. We have to keep reminding people that it is the great threat to liberty because it comprises the germ and develops the germ of every other. Armies and debts and taxes. And Madison was far from alone on this, and especially when you're talking about the armies end of it, standing armies were heavily an issue for anti-federalist and federalist alike. Here, for example, one that most people don't know about, an anti-federalist writer called a Democratic Federalist. Interesting that they use the term Federalist. Quick aside, those were terms of art, terms of propaganda. The anti-federalists actually considered themselves the ones that believed in true federalism. And the Federalists were actually for a more consolidated system than they had under, which is far still less consolidated or centralized than anything we can even dream of today. But they were actually looking for a little bit more consolidation than what happened under the Articles of Confederation. Here from a Democratic Federalist, October 17, 1787, the experience of past ages. So looking through history, they were students of history. Unlike most of us today, we're students of the last 5 minutes, according to my friend Mike Meharry. He talked about this in a recent video. He said, the experience of past ages and the result of the inquiries of the best and most celebrated patriots have taught us to dread a standing army above all earthly evils, the worst of them all. And maybe it was the same reason that Madison gave some years later, that it comprised and developed the germ of every other. I did an episode on this. I've done many episodes on this, but specifically James Madison's quotes, his warnings on war and power. I will link to that episode in the show notes. And that brings me to category number 2, which is consolidation. Consolidation means centralization of power. So the more that power is in fewer and fewer hands, the more that there are one-size-fits-all solutions or proposals for a country as large as a union of states, as large as we live in. And think of the comparison. At the time, the population was relatively sparse. I mean, we're still talking just a small number of states in comparison to the size and scope of today. It's not even close. And even then, they were concerned about centralization and consolidation of power because, again, they were students of history. This is one of the base maxims, the founding generation's principles of what they were trying to work towards or against, actually. Thomas Jefferson, here he put it this way: what has destroyed liberty and the rights of man in every government which has ever existed under the sun? The generalizing and concentrating all cares and powers into one body. Thomas Jefferson looked through history and he saw that guaranteed every single time you centralize power, it would destroy, not just attack liberty, but absolutely destroy it. Even James Wilson. So Jefferson was not Federalist nor anti-Federalist. In a 1789 letter to, I think, Francis Hopkinson, he specifically said he was closer to the Federalist side than anti-Federalist, but there was no way he was on either team. And he said specifically, if I could go to heaven, if I had to have a party to go to heaven, I would not go there at all. So he was so against the idea of aligning with one side or other and decided just to go with his own principles. But James Wilson was one of the big government guys at the time. We often think of Alexander Hamilton, possibly Gouverneur Morris, but James Wilson certainly was on the side of more centralization. And even he sounds like an Articles of Confederation supporter compared to basically every politician alive today. He said, to support with vigor a single government over the whole extent of the United States would demand a system of the most unqualified and the most unremitted despotism. So to have one government making all the choices over everything that we do, like whether or not we can grow a plant in our backyard, or what kind of light bulb we can have, or what our health decisions are going to be, or what size our toilet may be, what size our street signs are going to be, whether or not we can defend ourselves, what products we can own and buy and sell. If you're going to have one government making those decisions over the entire country, you are going to have unremitted and unqualified despotism, according to James Wilson, the big government guy. There's no comparison today. So consolidation, a huge one. Here's Patrick Henry, who was all against ratification. So we got a kind of a mix of views from all different sides with the same perspective. And Patrick Henry was warning in the Virginia Ratifying Convention that, there's going to be dangers when it comes to government. Government, he said, it's a standing maxim that government is no better than a choice among evils. So he recognized a very long-standing truth. No matter what, government is going to be some kind of evil. So you're going to choose the lesser, maybe? Not necessarily, not in the way that people think of it today. I shouldn't get off track on that one. But he's saying dangers are going to come no matter what we do. Dangers are to be apprehended in whatever manner we proceed. But those of a consolidation are the most destructive. And he had many speeches in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. I hope to cover them in detail in a series of episodes in the near-ish future. But he also said that the more that I look at this, the more I'm convinced that consolidation must end in the destruction of our liberty. Here's Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution. He said, the people of the United States under one consolidated government cannot long remain free, or indeed under any kind of government, but despotism. I think the best episode I've done on the dangers of consolidation comes from the great anti-federalist Brutus in my series of his papers. The first one was on October 9th, 2020, where I think he did a better job. I think it was just generally understood in the founding generation that consolidation was bad. The question was, under the ratification debates, was this going to lead to consolidation or not? And that was really what the debate was. But Brutus specifically, I think, did better than anyone and went into more detail explaining why consolidation would lead to a destruction of liberty, rather than just saying it does and everyone just nods their head in agreement, because we should all understand that. I will link to that episode in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Category number 3 is factions. Here's John Adams in a letter to, I think, Jonathan Jackson, October 2nd, 1780. He said, there is nothing which I dread so much as a division of the republic into two great parties. He knew that when you had one side versus the other, just all people would, over time, eventually look to each side. And I mentioned on Monday's show how the copy that we have of the works of Sallust from the great Thomas Gordon in 1744, where in that he talks about how people become so corrupt by their devotion to factions. I was talking about the thin blue line on Monday's episode. When they become so corrupt by that they make decisions based on what's good or bad, based on an affiliation with a group, whether it's a political party or an organization or whatever it may be. And John Adams had an early copy of that with a bunch of notes in the margins. And so I think he learned quite a bit from that. It really struck with him. And here he is some years later saying that there's nothing which he dreads so much as a division of the republic into two great parties. This made its way. James Madison wrote the first edition of George Washington's farewell address when he was expected to leave office after one term in 1792. Alexander Hamilton made some revisions to Madison's original draft under Washington's direction. So this isn't really a Hamiltonian or a Madisonian view. It's a Washington view with their flair in each version. But here's how Washington put it in the final version of his farewell address, 1796. He said, the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, is itself a frightful despotism. And he said it would lead to a permanent despotism. It's pretty much what we live under today. We have the largest government in the history of the world. We have everybody turning everything into a political thing. You're either on this side or you're that. And depending on who's in power, it changes. I mean, you can have the crunchiest, most granola-y people opposing big pharma for decades, and then all of a sudden they're like, I eat all organic food. I was tweeting about this last night. I eat all organic food and wear only organic clothes, but I only inject pharmaceuticals in my body. So it's interesting how people switch around based on the scenario. They're back and forth, and they don't really have core principles. A lot of people do not. What they have is love and attachment to a faction. What the founders warned about. I'm going to link to another episode in the show notes. Factions, warnings from 8 leading founders. This was back in July of 2020. Now, number 3, wait, that was number 3. So we had war, consolidation, factions is 3, 4 is fear. And again, John Adams here this is actually from Thoughts on Government, and he sent it to George Wythe in April of 1776. He said, fear is the foundation of most governments. You know, if you've listened to me mention this phrase before, this quote before, the only thing I would do to improve it is remove the word most, because fear is the foundation of government. If people weren't afraid of other human beings, they wouldn't try to get government to use its force to protect them. Whether it's through regulations or even just investigating crimes of person, property, fraud, theft, things like that, even what government should do at its bare minimum if it's going to exist. But people are fearful, and that's what gives them more and more power. James Madison also recognized this some years later in a letter to Thomas Jefferson. This is in the ramp up in spring of 1798, in the ramp up to John Adams, of all people, then signing the hated Alien and Sedition Acts into law of 1798. Here, excuse me, here's James Madison writing to Thomas Jefferson. He said, perhaps it is a universal truth, that the loss of liberty at home is to be charged to provisions against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. Think about that. Even if it's real, if it's a real danger, people are still fearful of that real danger, and they give up liberty in the hopes that government will protect them. But then if the protection means you're giving up liberty, what are you actually being protected from? John Taylor of Caroline wrote about that some years later, and we're going to be celebrating the anniversary of the publication of one of his great books at the beginning of February. We've got an article queued up to publish from Jim Bovard, who was absolutely awesome. But he actually said, you know, if you have to actually take liberty to protect liberty, you're defeating the purpose by its means. What's the point? And Madison recognized this in his letter to Jefferson. Like, it doesn't matter if you think it's real or not. If you think the threat is real, they're going to take liberty. If there is no threat, they might make one up. And they're going to take liberty, and it's all based on fear. And fear, I think, leads to compliance and submission. People are fearful of what might happen. They're fearful of sticking their neck out. They're fearful of taking a stand for liberty. They're fearful of exercising their rights without permission from government first. And that leads to what James Otis warned about in 1767. He said, there is nothing that will destroy liberty more than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. Nothing to James Otis. This is the founding father of the Fourth Amendment. John Adams actually referred to his great arguments against the writs of assistance in 1761 as the beginning of the American Revolution, the revolution being a revolution in the views and thoughts and political sentiments of the people. And there in 1761, he asserted the idea of American sovereignty, that is, final authority being within the people and not with government. An act against the Constitution is void. And here he is a few years later pointing out that as long as people decide that they're not going to stand up for their liberty, we know that government power always seeks to grow. Politicians, no matter who they are, will always try to grow their power. And if people always submit to that power, there's no reason for them to ever give it back. There's no reason at all. And so James Otis Jr. thought that this was the greatest threat to liberty. And I actually did an episode on that just earlier this month, January 3rd, 22. And I urge you to check it out. Compliance is Violence. John Dickinson and Lysander Spooner on the Path to Liberty, talking about how resistance and noncompliance is what keeps government in check. And then the last one that I have here, let me pull up my notes, is attacks on free speech, free press, and the like. Here's Benjamin Franklin, very young, 1722, I think. And he put it this way. This is in Silence Do-Good number 8, I believe. Who I'll link to these in the show notes. I've got them all prepped somewhere in the 10th Amendment Center blog. He said, whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech. Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech. I have to repeat that. Because as long as they can continue pushing out one message, then people don't ever hear about other ideas. If the only solution to every single problem is a government solution, going to more government, maybe people don't actually think of it on their own. People have to learn from reading, from watching, from listening, from sharing ideas. And when people can't do that, then that is the first step of putting people on their knees, according to a young Benjamin Franklin. And I think he held that kind of view throughout his life. Here's Samuel Adams talking about this in regards to the free press, not a controlled government-backed press, but an actual free press. And I think in some ways today, this is why we see so many well, let me read the quote first. There is nothing so terrible to tyrants, and he put terrible in all caps. There is nothing so terrible to tyrants and their tools and abettors as a free press. I love that you see this often from the founders and old revolutionaries talking about people who support tyranny as tools of tyrants, knaves and fools and things like that. And the father of the American Revolution said, as long as people are helping them out, they're just tools. But the way to oppose them is by sharing other information. And a free press does not mean a government-backed, government-approved, government-controlled press. And that's why they hate the internet, the freedom of the internet, as much as there is today, which is actually far greater freedom of speech than we had when there were, like when I was a kid, man, you'd turn on 3 TV stations. They all had approved government messages. At least we have a chance, and they really want to get that under control by using a lot of fear to say, oh, if people can just say what they want, share misinformation and disinformation, then we're all going to die. We're all going to die if people can share their viewpoints. Let's shut them up. It's always about shutting them up. Don't share their viewpoints. And that's Samuel Adams on free speech. And George Washington explained this to Edmund Pendleton, why this matters, why it's so important that people have to be able to hear another side of the story. That doesn't mean they have to hear the other side of the story in every publication and every location, but people have to have the ability to get this information out. He said, when one side only of a story is heard and often repeated, the human mind becomes impressed with it insensibly. So if there's going to be a subduing of the freedom of speech, maybe the only subduing should be of the propaganda, but that's a dangerous game. And I understand how people don't like that, because what is determined to be propaganda is by the people who have power. So we don't want to be on board with that kind of thing. And with that, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. This is something to think about at all times. So if you want to take action in support of liberty, these are things to think about from the founding generation. What are the greatest threats to liberty? Whether we're doing education, activism, resistance, and the like, this is all really important stuff. Of course, if you support the show, and I'm going to check the live chat here in just a moment. If you support us, you support our work at the TAC and our efforts to nullify everything bit by bit, piece by piece. We can only do so much every single day, but we certainly are rolling up our sleeves every single day of the year to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty. Nothing helps us get that work done more than the financial faith of our members. And it starts out at just $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Let me take a look. Run Level 1. Run Level 1 says the press is free. CNN, MSNBC, and Fox all tell me so. That's pretty hilarious. That's actually really funny. Opinions are just opinions, says Clay Kent. Haji says, thank you for this excellent exposition. I appreciate it. Jim Black got here late. See, this is what I'm talking about. The notifications don't always come on time. A lot of times we get people telling us that they didn't get a notification until the show was over. I'm not sure, Jim, if you got showed up late and saw the notification late, or if Facebook did a bad job, which they often do. But I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate you considering watching the show over whatever platform you're on. If it's live streaming, generally it takes a little while for the platform to process and encode the video, and then it'll be available to rewatch, or you can go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Stephanie Ramirez says, so good, Bolden. See you on RSB. My great friend Robert Scott Bell does a Sunday through Friday show. Monday through Friday is when I'm listening. It is noon Pacific time, and I'm actually going to do an interview with him at 1 p.m. Pacific time a week from Friday. I guess that is the 4th? Friday the 4th. Scrolling through a little bit more on the chat. Patricia Dance loves that Jefferson quote. Yeah, he certainly talked about centralization of power quite a bit, especially in the 1800s. He recognized that it was so dangerous. And what he saw was really dangerous was how the federal judiciary, and it was a nice reminder from my friend Liberty Revolutionary in Missouri, who's done so much great work in support of the Second Amendment Preservation Act, along with many other people. And he specifically was referencing a letter, I think it was to Joseph C. Cabell, 1816-ish, where he was talking about how he was watching this play out and he saw the engine of consolidation being the federal judiciary. And this was before the federal judiciary had nearly as much power as it gave itself in the 1920s and how it has it today. Run Level Run talks about hate speech laws. Yes, absolutely. Otis, my man, Otis. Oh, that was a different Otis. Yeah, Haji. Tons of great quotes here. I will link to all the original source documents so you can read them in context. There's a lot of great info out there, and this is just a tiny bit of it. One of them I really didn't focus on quite a bit was on, for example, the standing army message. And I think a lot of that really tied in with warnings about war, and I think the quote from Democratic Federalist was an important one. But one of the reasons that the founding generation was so in support of the natural right to self-defense, the right to keep and bear arms, is because the more armed up a population was, even with military-grade weapons, the less likely they were going to have to rely on a large, permanent, standing military force, which they all agreed would result in a loss of liberty. Samuel Adams, George Mason, and Elbridge Gerry called it the bane of liberty to have a standing armies. Anyways, again, I hope you appreciate this information. I hope you learned something. I hope it made you think. If you support us, don't forget that membership program, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can also smash the like button. Leave a review on Apple Podcast or any other podcast platform. That helps a ton. Comments in the archive on the video platform, subscribing, getting notifications. On all the mainstream platforms, that does help trigger the algorithm and tells them to show the program to more people. And I really appreciate your help in spreading the word. Thank you so much for spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you on Friday.